Thank you, Ed. So as Ed said, my name is Dave Neary. I'm a member of the Red Hat Open Source Program Office, and I'm also a former board member of the Mifos Foundation. It's a project that's near and dear to my heart. What I would like to cover today is a few things. I'd like to talk about some of the digital transformation challenges that organizational leaders face, and how open source can help you address those challenges. And specifically, we're going to talk about what an upstream first approach means. We're going to talk about that metaphor, upstream versus downstream, and maybe work through some of the reasons why an upstream first approach to open source development makes sense. So let's start with some of the challenges. I think no matter what industry you're in, competitive landscapes today are changing. The internet, the cloud, the mobile revolution have changed every single business, and organizations everywhere are struggling to keep pace with the technological changes, with the changes in, methodology, new emerging tech competitors. The needs of customers are evolving faster than ever, and technology is central to all of this. The role of technology and IT departments inside pretty much every company has become central to the value proposition and the core business of the company now. I like this quote from Ellucian CIO Lee Congdon. It seems to lay out the stakes pretty clearly. From every single department, whether it's legal, manufacturing, supply chain, procurement, digital technology is rapidly changing and could be greatly improving all areas of your enterprise. In many cases, IT teams are central to organizational change. These changes present challenges across the entire organization. Some of the challenges that I've seen expressed are, how do we innovate faster? How do we use innovation to generate new forms of customer value, deliver new products? We have trouble getting products to market in time. We want to have faster time to market. We want to match the pace of our competitors and stay ahead of other people in our market. We want to respond quickly in the face of new and unforeseen competitors, new and unforeseen circumstances in the world. We want to attract and retain the best talent. That's a challenge. Engaging employees in organizational changes, having a kind of an open decision-making process, breaking down the silos, the move to DevOps and bringing people together. And especially relevant these days, how do you enable employees, particularly with the shutdown that we're all experiencing right now, how do you enable employees and customers to be productive in an increasingly connected and disconnected world? BYOD, working from home, enabling remote employees, and so on. So there is a danger in digital transformation that we focus too much on the digital part and not enough on the transformation part. I think technology on its own is not enough for a successful transformation. That requires a complete approach that addresses people and process and tools. The cultural change and evolving methodologies are actually just as important as the tools you use to successfully transform and adapt to the world that we're in. And my employer, Red Hat, all of our products are built on open source, but more than that, we have embraced the open collaborative approach to working together. That open approach can help evolve organizations along all of the axes: people, process, and tools. And this is where open source comes into the picture. So I'm not sure what the experience level of everybody here is, so I'm going to give a brief overview of the concept of open source at a high level, because it's kind of central to everything else today. So at the highest level, open source is a development methodology. It's a way of making software, which is made possible by a specific licensing decision. Someone decides to explicitly make code available to others under the terms of a license that grants users what are known as the 4 freedoms. The 4 freedoms of free software. Open source software is also known as free software by people who want to emphasize that freedom aspect of the licenses. Users always have the freedom to use the software for any purpose they'd like. It also means that the people can see the source code of the software and understand how it works. They can view the source code. That decision, the decision to publish source code, is an invitation to participate. It's an invitation to join in a collaborative endeavor, to work together as a community, because when you can view the software, then you can modify the software. You can change it to suit your own needs. And the fourth freedom is the freedom to publish those changes. And this is really the superpower. This is what turbocharges open source development. Open source, to me, is not just about consuming software from a central source and being able to modify it to my needs. It's also about the possibility to share those changes to create a collaborative environment around a common source base. So as you can see, this is a radically different approach to solving problems by building software than the proprietary software approach. And we've been operating this way for, there have been companies operating this way for 25 years. This is the traditional way that software has been developed right back to the 1960s. The advent of proprietary software is actually more recent than the advent of collaborative software development. But let's talk about why open source has become so dominant in the enterprise space. Open source is now a default choice for IT leaders in data centers and developers' workstations of all sizes and with all types of missions. More and more companies of all sizes are relying on open source tools for critical operations for many reasons. And I'd like to go into, there's a report that was published recently that was sponsored also by my employer that I think has some really, really interesting insights into how companies are using open source and how it fits into enterprise IT. But first, let's take a moment to talk about what enterprise open source means, and I'd like to talk about this upstream downstream metaphor. So the idea of upstream downstream is you can think of source code as flowing from the brain of a software developer who writes code. That code is published in an open source project. That open source project is then consumed by companies who want to deploy that open source project, either self-supporting or companies who want to create products based on that open source project and deploy that to their customers. And so that's that's the metaphor of upstream to downstream. The open source project, the open source community, is the upstream source of all of the enterprise deployments, the productized deployments, the professional deployments of software, which are downstream of it. So for enterprises, one of the benefits of open source, the rapid innovation, the fast-moving development, the ability to jump in and work on the specific thing that's most important to you, is also, one of the most frustrating qualities. Enterprises want the innovative benefits of open source, but they don't want the risk. And so enterprise open source is about providing an emphasis on stability and security, helping the change management of moving from one version to another, ensuring that it's easier to install in a specific configuration. So if we look at some of the benefits of community, these new features and updates are added rapidly, and oftentimes that is at odds with the needs of enterprise consumers. So enterprise open source, the productized versions, what you're deploying to your customers, if you're a company, that's where your value add is based on how do I provide stability and security. I'm going to manage updates and upgrades. I'm going to provide a service level agreement so that if there is a problem, somebody can get involved. Professional services, the ability to have something to rely on. And of course, the detailed and thorough documentation and training that customers need to be successful with your software. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that enterprise open source report that I mentioned. Full disclosure, this is a report that was sponsored by my employer, Red Hat, but the respondents were not Red Hat customers specifically, and they didn't know that that we were sponsoring the survey. So this is a general overview of the attitude to open source in enterprise computing, and how people are using it and for what. And the first thing, totally unsurprising, is 95% of respondents said that open source software was integral, either important, very important, or extremely important to their organization's infrastructure strategies. Open source is everywhere. I think that's unsurprising. Organizations reported using open source across numerous facets of infrastructure. The most popular were security, cloud management tools, databases, big data and analytics, but also developer tools, frameworks, and so on. And organizations are turning to open source solutions for many reasons. IT infrastructure modernization, application development, DevOps, all of the tools around automation, continuous delivery, continuous integration are open source primarily. And if you look at why people are using open source, they're doing it for a number of reasons. Higher quality of software, lower total cost of ownership, better security are the most prominent and the highest featured. But also, open source software is designed to work in the cloud, or a lot of cloud native technologies are open source. The ability to safely leverage open source technologies is the ability to get support and to get products based on and services based on the open source software is another reason why people are using it, and to get access to the latest innovations. So clearly, using enterprise-grade open source has some technical benefits, but I'd like to go back to the point I made earlier and say that technical solutions aren't enough to guarantee success with transformation. So we want to look at some of the additional benefits of open source, specifically the benefits of engaging with communities and becoming contributors and collaborators in the open source projects that are important to you. So the truth is, when you're making a technology decision to use open source, you're not just selecting a software stack, you're actually choosing an innovation model. You're making a statement about how your organization will operate, how it will produce value, how it will engage with customers, how you'll meet the challenges that new competitors pose, and you're embedding that statement in a set of tools that enable and disable certain organizational capacities. But to get the most out of the tools, you're going to need to rethink how you operate and generate value, how you work together with the projects that you're consuming, and also internally how your developer teams are organized. Thinking about these issues is exceedingly important. The highlighted part of this quote, I think, is really kind of gets to the nub of what I'm driving at here, is that we need to rethink old notions about how we compete, collaborate, and bring new products to market. The way that we work is really fundamental. Pardon me. The challenges are not purely technological. It's about how we work. It's about the culture that we bring to teams. And if we look at the biggest companies the companies that are now fully embracing software development, open source software development, publishing their own open source projects, participating with in the development of existing open source projects. All of the biggest technology companies in the world are now among the most prominent open source contributors. They're not just consuming open source software, they're now engaging with those open source projects and communities, publishing their own open source software, because they see a value in it, because they're reinventing how they operate. And these organizations are realizing that contributing back to open source projects yields significant benefits. Working with open source prepares an organization for making the kind of changes that they need to make for a successful digital transformation. If you look at some of the biggest trends in software development today, the move to cloud, the move to mobile, the embracing of agile DevOps, these are all driven by some of the best practices that have come from the open source community, whether that's engaging directly with your users as a development team, or using peer code review to increase code quality and reliability, whether it's breaking down silos to be more collaborative, or creating better software faster. Some of the benefits that I've seen mentioned for choosing to work openly, the ability to accelerate innovation for sure, to increase awareness of changes to product roadmaps, influencing the direction of technological development of products that are important, or projects that are important to you, increasing the size of your organization's impact, having an impact way beyond what you can do yourself because you're working with others. You're not doing all of the heavy lifting. Providing a framework for collaboration, creating a culture of collaboration, scaling innovation and development effort within a community. All of these are benefits of open source. And it also addresses some of the things that I mentioned earlier, right? The ability to attract and retain talent, to increase software security and reliability, and to give you the freedom to be more agile in responding to industry changes, because you're building on an existing base of software. So there are also some challenges. I think it's important not to paint too rosy a picture here. Working this way is not without its challenges. Some of those may be, some of the things that I've seen are legal departments who are not yet at ease with open source. So there are intellectual property questions and policy questions related to contributing to open source projects. There's a perception of security vulnerabilities and risks, and certainly that's increased in recent times with issues like Heartbleed and other high-profile vulnerabilities at the hardware level, but also at the software level. Buy-in from senior leadership is fundamental to engaging in open source projects, and if you don't have it, it can be a huge challenge to get started. But then there's some more practical issues as well. It takes some time to learn the best practices of open source, and particularly if you have a professional software development team that's not used to working in that way, it can take a long time to build up that muscle. And as a result, if you're publishing source code, you can find yourself with a large community of users, but very little community participation. We also have all of the difficulties around, procurement departments, the supplier management. All of those systems are set up for companies working with companies. What happens when you're adopting open source software? That can change the dynamics and the rules there a lot. And certainly that's been an issue in, for example, in the public sector. But it's an issue that we're working around. So there are challenges as well. We shouldn't be going into this with rose-colored glasses, but I think you can agree. I think we can agree that embracing open source, both open source development and the cultural aspects of working on open source, can really help spark change inside your company, inside your organizations. And I'd like to go through a little bit some of what we might think of as the impacts to your business, how we're able to operate in a rapidly changing world, and the benefits of taking an open approach, both in terms of development practices, but also in terms of how you work. So what if open source was more than a way of creating software? I believe in the power of community software development, and the community part is actually the thing that's the most important to me. Open source is more than a software development methodology. It's an ethos, it's an ethic, it's a way of thinking and acting in the world. When you're coming at things from an open, collaborative perspective, you're always thinking not just what are my needs, but what are the needs of this community, and how can we ensure that the entire community or the entire project is successful. I often hear colleagues say that they've been in the same job for over a decade working on the same project, although who they get their paycheck from has changed. They put the project, the success of the project is just as important to them as the success of their employer. And I think you'll find that that's a common sentiment in the software development industry among some of the most successful open source projects. Jim Whitehurst, the CEO of Red Hat, and I know I've mentioned Red Hat a few times. This is not intended to be a commercial presentation. It's just this has been a really I guess some of the source material that I found the most useful has come from things like the Open Organization. Our CEO was so confused when he joined the company about how we could be successful with such a disorganized way of working as it appeared at first glance. That when he finally got his got his arms around, got his head around how Red Hat has managed to be successful, he wrote a book on it called The Open Organization. And some of the things that that he writes is, you know, imagine the impact of applying the power of decentralizing authority, talent from a diverse range of organizations and backgrounds, including external volunteers that come along and help help you achieve the things that you want to achieve. Imagine being able to unleash that and what that would do for your organization as well. So the idea of the open organization is how the principles of open source can drive organizational change and not just software. But we see that in other fields as well. There's in the field of design, we're seeing an approach to co-design, working with customers, a more participative, inclusive, collaborative approach to building things. So whether you're working in a public sector area where you're working to for example, one of the most interesting examples that I've come across is Greenpeace, adopting this kind of open organization approach, not just for their own internal working, but also in working with NGOs around joint collaborative projects. You can take the lessons of open source, the ways that we work on software, and you can apply them in a whole range of organizational situations. So the question of organizational culture, this is the methodology side of it. This is the processes side of it that I was talking about earlier. These new organizational techniques and architectures, whether it's Scrum, Agile, DevOps, Holacracy, however you call it, the idea of these is breaking down large changes into smaller changes, breaking down organizational barriers and increasing communication across an organization, way above what you would typically expect to have as a productive kind of communication overhead in traditional software, waterfall software development teams. It's about being flexible and planning short-term cycles and building those cycles together. It's about being collaborative and reviewing other people's changes, working with other people, whether that's pair programming, peer review. It's about integrating best practices with tooling into your development processes, whether that's the implementation of a CI pipeline or automated tests. All of these practices have come from open source. If you think about the change in the way that we've developed software, all of these best practices have come from the open source culture. And no single technique is perfect for any organization. Different organizations are implementing these in different ways. But the common theme is that, you know, applying open culture and open techniques actually improves the way that your organization is delivering software. And all of these methodologies reflect a desire to become a more open organization, to have an increased transparency, inclusivity, to be more adaptable to change in the way that, for example, if you think of the Linux kernel in 1991, it was started as a college project for x86. The initial email from Linus Torvalds said something explicitly along the lines of, this is full of a bunch of kludges to make it work on x86, and it will probably never be portable to any other platform. Within a year, it was running on half a dozen hardware platforms because other people jumped in, and there was an adaptability and an openness to change and to taking care of other use cases, which ensured the project's success. And of course, collaboration and community. The idea of working together with people who are potentially competitors, but working together on the places where we can work together so that we compete and differentiate elsewhere on top. So open technologies are fantastic, but open tools are only as useful as the people who are using those tools. So the biggest challenge to successful open source development is actually this piece. It is moving your people to this mind frame of sharing first, working with others, collaborating upstream. Open people are more likely to gravitate towards open tools, open source. They're more likely to create and innovate when given the open platforms that you give, when given open platforms to work on. So I'd like to point out another resource. This is a workbook, the Open Organization Guide to IT Culture Change, which you may find useful. I recommend you check it out. It's free to download at the URL below. It's openly licensed, so you can do with it what you will. And another resource that I'd like to point out is the Open Practice Library. This is a curated library of best practices for organizational change. Again, I strongly recommend it. And now I would like to talk specifically about Upstream first. So I've talked about Upstream and what it is, but why? This is the kind of the biggest question that we have to answer is why is it in your interest to work directly in the Upstream project? And I know this has been a challenge for many, many companies, is justifying the time and the resources and the overhead that comes from engaging with an open source project. But this is, I think, the best way to build products on open source. If you look at the number of ways in which you can create a product from an open source project, you essentially have 4 choices on how to interact with the open source project you're building on. One is to pick the version of the open source project that's closest to what you need, copy it into your infrastructure, modify it as you need, and keep those changes basically to yourself. This is what some people might call a fork. You're making changes locally to a specific version of the base project. You never integrate changes that are coming in from the parent project. And this is a fine approach if what you want to do is for example, embed software in a piece of hardware and it's never going to change. However, you're missing out on all of the software development that everybody else who works on the community is doing. Everything that gets committed to, for example, the Linux kernel or the Kubernetes project is improving the project for everyone. And if you take this approach, you're not getting any of those improvements. And that might be fine for the first 6 months or the first 12 months. But what you find is that over time, it becomes harder and harder for you to figure out, to adapt the software that you've chosen to keep up with what the Upstream project is doing. So what many companies come to is this second approach, this copy and rebase approach. So the idea of you copy the Upstream project, you make the changes that you want to make in the project, and then when the next version or 2 versions down the line, you see some features that are interesting in the Upstream project, you take all of the changes from the Upstream project and you integrate that into your local copy. That's called a rebase. The issue with that is that you find that the changes that you've made will not fit completely with all of the changes that have come from the parent project. So you have to spend some time integrating that project, merging code, making sure that if you've developed something in a way that's different to what the community has done, that the software continues to work in the way it's supposed to. And so you don't just have that rebase phase where you're merging code, but you also have a validation phase where you're trying to figure out, what's changed, and you can find some very, very niche corner case type bugs where 2 pieces of code are put side by side and it kind of slightly changes the behavior in certain edge cases. So this is a very costly operation to do, this rebase and merge. And the thing is, it's not a one-off cost, because if you're going to be building a product on an open source project, you'll find that this cost is coming back over and over and over again. This is not something you do once, it's something you will do half a dozen or a dozen times over the lifetime of the project. And more than being a kind of a fixed cost that you have every 6 months, if you continue to develop code on top of this common base, every 6 months it actually gets harder, because the more code you have in your private copy, the more code specific to your users and customers and the features that you care about, the harder it becomes to do that merge. And what we've seen is it's like compounding interest. If you try and make this approach work for a long term, what you find is that you will eventually be spending all of your time doing this copy, rebase, merge, validation phase. Your feature development slows to a glacial pace. So you're not adding value. So typically, companies come to this third approach. Well, why don't we attempt to push code to the project? We've developed all these cool features. Won't the community want them? And so you push large changes, completed features towards the community. And unfortunately, this is you can almost kind of see this as a mirroring of the 4 freedoms, where your initial approach is, well, I'm free to use this as I want, so I'm going to use it. And then your second approach is, well, I can make modifications and I can integrate changes, so let's do that. And now this is our attempt to publish changes. But what you find is that to have code accepted into a community project, there are a few things that you need to do that you don't need to do if you're working on your own. What I call the community overhead. One of those is that, let's say you've chosen version 2.1 of a project to build your product on. Well, maybe that code doesn't work or doesn't merge cleanly on version 3. So the community is going to expect new code to be pushed to its the tip of its latest branch, the tip of its master. And if you're trying to propose features for an old branch, well, the community may not be interested in those. Maybe the patches will languish in a bug tracker somewhere because nobody will be interested in reviewing them. Also, communities expect you to propose patches in small, self-contained chunks. If you have a large feature that's maybe 2,000 or 3,000 lines of code, nobody is going to review that for you because it's too big. It's just you're asking people to give of their time, and they're happy to do it typically, but you're asking them to give a big chunk of time for something that they're not sure it's going to be valuable to the project at all. So large patches tend to get reviewed much more slowly than small patches. So often what you'll find is that the cost of this approach is very high as well. And there are a number of examples that I could share where large companies have developed a lot of code out of tree, a lot of code independent of the upstream community, and then the upstream community has not shown interest in that code when it comes back. And in fact, there's a high-profile example where a large internet company, and I won't name, it may become obvious as I tell the story. A large internet company developing a mobile operating system made significant changes to the Linux kernel, proposed those changes for inclusion, and the changes were widely panned initially. And a year later, those changes were reproposed, and somebody from the community proposed an alternative, which ended up being accepted, which required this large company not only to abandon their efforts to get their changes into the Linux kernel, but it required them to redevelop the code that they had already developed to adopt to this new mechanism which had been included. So for my money, in the specific situation where you are building a product on an open source project and you expect to have a long-term strategic relationship between your product and the project you're building on, the upstream first approach is what makes sense. This is what Red Hat does, and I think that we've shown over time that this is the most cost-efficient way to develop a product on top of an open source project. What upstream first means is that you develop new functionality first in the community project, and then you productize once those changes have been accepted, or once you're, at the very least, once you're sure that those changes are aligned with the community requirements and are likely to be accepted. So let's go with that scenario that I talked about earlier, where you've got the community is working on a version 3 of a software and you're building a product on version 2.1. What that would mean is you develop your new version against the tip of version 3. And when the feature is reviewed and accepted into the tip of that branch, then if you want to include that feature in an update to your product based on version 2.1, you have the extra work of taking those changes and bringing them back to 2.1 and doing the integration and validation yourself. That's what we call backporting. Or you have the possibility to productize the 3.0 branch and bring your customers forward to that new version. Reducing the delta between your products and the upstream projects this is the way that the open source community works. We create stabilizing branches for the stable releases of our software, and then we have development branches where we're developing new features. And very regularly, bug fixes, security fixes are backported to that stabilization branch, but all new feature development is happening on the development branch. And then when that development branch is ready to be released as a version, we create a new stabilization branch, and then we continue development on the development branch. This is the way upstream projects, open source projects, have worked forever. And I think this is the most cost-efficient way to develop products. So I wanted to share a few more resources. Obviously, as Ed said, these slides will be available, so these links are also available. These are, in addition to the open practice library that I've already mentioned, 3 resources which are some blog posts that I've written in the past related to Upstream first, building products from open source software, how to craft an open source product strategy, an effective way to align your organization around the goal of engaging with an open source software community, and 7 questions to steer open source project community development in terms of, pardon me, identifying the ways in which identifying the environment of your open source project to better target your target audience, understanding the communities that you're related to and how you fit in there. And I invite you to read these as you will. So to summarize, I think we can agree that digital transformation is altering the competitive landscape. I believe that an open source approach is the most effective approach to organizational transformation in terms of changing culture and also processes to allow organizational culture to adapt to the changes around us in the world. We see in the industry that enterprises are increasingly turning to open source technology for business critical work and value creation as part of that digital transformation. And the best way to influence and get value from those open source ecosystems is to participate in them. And finally, embracing those open operating principles alongside open source tools can spur the cultural change that's beneficial to the transformation. So with that, thank you. I will now stop to, I think we have about 15 minutes for Q&A.
Thank you, Dave. That was very insightful and informative. So we want to open the floor to any questions that the attendees might have. So feel free to, raise your hand, and we can, allow you to verbalize the question, or if you want to type your question in the chat panel, you can share it there. So looking forward to hearing your questions and, identifying how you can practically apply the approaches that Dave shared with us today to your own team's product development strategies. And these strategies, that Dave outlined, we're trying to, better follow these across the community to ensure, that if you choose to adopt these approaches, you're able to find, these stable and development branches and take this upstream first approach that was outlined. So look forward to hearing what questions you have. And thank you, Dave, for reserving time at the end to field these questions. Were you able to see Alberto's question, Dave? So
I am. I'm going to repeat the question for the recording. Do I have any suggestions or comment about resistance to change? Yes, this is one of the most interesting aspects. So one of the patterns that I've seen recur in organizations is that you'll get a kind of a sandwich effect, where senior leadership is bought in on the strategic interests of engaging with open source, and will say from on high, yes, we are doing open source, we are engaging, we want to get serious about open source. And at the lowest level, the developers who are working on the projects are very enthusiastic about working on open source and engaging in open source communities that they use. This is something that, it's actually a selling point for a lot of companies. If you can say, you will be able to work on the open source projects that we depend on. That's actually something that people are very interested in. But where things get gummed up is in the middle. It's the engineering managers, the business leaders who are driving a line of business, who don't see a direct value to the bottom line, and they see the costs. And so they see the cost in terms of the time and effort it takes. It does take longer to do open source software in an upstream first manner. It does take time to work through community concerns about features that you're interested in. Maybe that means, from my experience in the telco world, that means having to translate from telco speak and acronyms to a language that the open source communities for things like hypervisors or infrastructure as a service projects will understand. So you need to take time to explain the context for your request, and not just come along and say, you know, I'm the biggest telco in the USA and I need this feature, so you will develop it for me. That's not how it works. So that there are costs involved, and that middle management layer is the place where those costs are often born. So one of the things in that blog post, you know, how to create an open source product strategy, one of the things that I explore is the fundamental importance of understanding how engaging with the open source project impacts your bottom line, impacts your organization. And if you can get that level of clarity on your goals, you know, what am I trying to achieve with this investment? Because that's what it is. It is a cost. If it's a cost, you want to make those costs explicit, and you want to make those costs well understood, because when it's explicit and you understand what the trade-offs are, then you can say to somebody, yes, I understand that this is taking 30% of a developer's time working upstream, but I want you to understand that this project being successful is going to allow us to do this thing that we couldn't otherwise do. And that may be, you know, advancing the development of a standard that we care about. It may be growing our market share because we're getting faster development. It may be market education. You know, we're going into this greenfield area and people don't know how to do serverless programming, for example. So by educating people in serverless programming, even if that's not something that we're getting money for immediately now, we're creating an opportunity for down the road. If you make those kind of trade-offs explicit and well understood, you will find that that provides context for getting around some of that resistance to change. There's also some, you know, basic inertia to change, right? There's people don't like to change, and I'm coincidentally reading a book right now called Switch: How to Change Things When Change is Hard, which goes into some of the structure. It's not enough to appeal to the reason of people. You need to make it easy for them to change, and you need to also appeal to the emotional side of the person. You know, what's the goal? And I think in terms of open source technologies and open source methodologies, one of the most effective things that I have seen in my own career is, if something is a useful practice to you, it'll be useful to other people. So for example, in one organization I worked for, getting people to use source control was a challenge, or getting people to use a bug tracker was a challenge. So I installed a bug tracker, and I maintained at the time a Subversion repository, so that I could use those things. And anytime people were asking me for something, I would create an entry in the bug tracker, and I would send them a link to the entry so that they could track progress. After a while, people started creating bug tracker entries themselves rather than coming to me and having me do it. After a while of using source control, we had an issue where there was a bug in a customer's deployment, and I could identify by bisecting in source control, I could identify the specific commit where the issue happened, and in 10 minutes I had fixed the issue. So by showing the value of the tools, by using them, I found that it became social. It became kind of contagious, which is not a good word to use right now, but you know, best practices can be you know, they spread because people see the benefit of to the people who are using them. I also see we have 2 questions in Q&A, Ed. Let me go for the second question first. Generally, some of the features requested by clients are very organization specific and not applicable to all organizations. In such cases, we still will be left with local branches that are not linked to the upstream. That's absolutely correct.
Oh, and before you go in on that one, Dave, I think that's an important one because one of the, you know, messages we're trying to communicate to our community is that, you know, with this upstream of first approach, you can still maintain, you know, your roadmap, but then you also have an anti-roadmap, which is a set of features, you know, that you're not planning to share back with the community, but recognizing, you know, that there is this explicit line that you can draw between, you know, some enhancements that you do retain on your own. So I think this question from Rehan gets at that as well. So looking forward to your response.
Yes, and so that's absolutely correct. There are times when what a customer wants is going to be very organization specific. I can tell you from a personal perspective that what we do is if we get a specific request like this, typically I'll start asking questions. It will be, you know, what exactly are you trying to achieve? Why do you feel like this is an important feature that you need? And what I find is it's often possible to extract some kind of generic or general functionality and have the customer specific stuff be in deployment scripts or in configuration options. And doing it in that way actually allows you to upstream at least the chunk, a big chunk of what you're developing for a specific customer, which allows you to reduce the cost of doing similar changes for other customers, even if they are slightly different requirements. So yes, an upstream first approach does not mean that you don't do any private development. It does mean that you want to minimize the amount of private development, because that delta between the upstream and your private development, that delta has a cost, as I was saying earlier. Which resource has more cases like where changes did not get accepted into the Linux kernel because someone proposed an alternative approach? I don't think that I can give a specific pointer to a specific resource, but there are a number of cases. Actually, there are a number of cases in the Linux kernel specifically along those lines. There's another case from over 20 years ago where a small company called Sistina developed a volume management system, and a slightly larger company called IBM also developed a volume management system for the Linux kernel. And Linus merged the Sistina changes, LVMS2, I think it was, and IBM had to redevelop all of their enterprise volume management software to use the Sistina's LVM implementation. So there are a number of examples. I don't have a specific link that I can point you to, I'm afraid.
And then similar question, Dave, but going back to, you know, Alberto's question around resistance to change, and, you know, you spoke to the engineering manager and that middle management level being difficult to, you know, convince or get over the hump. Like, do you have any good like reports or statistics on that additional value of taking an upstream approach versus, you know, developing everything in private? So.
Right. Well, so let me give a few examples. some from personal experience and some that are a little different. But if you look at Nokia in the 2000s, so about 15 years ago, they started working on a mobile operating system called MIMO, and they spent millions of dollars, dozens of man years. They had a large development team, and they made changes to the GDK graphical toolkit to ensure that they could use this toolkit for their mobile operating system. And unfortunately, they engaged with the GNOME community once those changes were done. And what they found was it was very, very difficult for them to get, what ended up being, I think, about 200,000 lines of code integrated into GTK. They spent years, several man years of effort to refactor the code to first try and get it into GTK initially. And second, they ended up eventually paying companies to do some of the work to get that code integrated into the Upstream GTK. And after all of that, they still had not completed the work to get it upstream. So I think that you can see the value of an upstream first approach there in terms of the cost that they bore afterwards. Other companies have had to write off similar efforts. There's another mobile company I won't mention who had at one point 200 developers working on GDK behind closed doors, and all of that investment has now been written off because the Upstream project moved on, circumstances changed, and the changes that they had made ended up being lost. When if they had been upstream, perhaps that platform would have been more successful, and they might not have lost that investment. I have another example. Let me see. There's a good example again from the infrastructure space where there's a large project which is essentially a collection of code that have been written by an infrastructure vendor. They're patches to the operating system, to OpenStack, to the hypervisor. And all of those patches were building on each other for specific features that they were selling to their customers. And the cost of bearing those changes ended up becoming too large for them. And so they ended up spending some money to spin out this project as a kind of a standalone project under one of the larger nonprofits in the open source area. And that project has struggled to get traction. So again, a situation where not working upstream has had a very high cost, both in terms of maintenance of the code over the long term, and then when you finally try and get the code upstream, in terms of not being able to do that. Again, I don't want to I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, to use an American idiom, which means to name the guilty here. But there are a number of circumstances where not engaging has had significant costs. I don't know if that answers the question you asked, Ed.
No, that was helpful, Dave. And then did you want to read out the comment that Michael made in the chat, Dave?
Sure. So one thing you could do, this is all from Michael, one thing you could do if you have customer organization specific customization, if you cannot avoid them in the first place, like Dave is explaining, is to contribute something that makes the upstream project extensible in a way that you can do functionality in downstream without having to rebase, without having the rebase burden in diverging code. And that's a very, very good point. You can create, for example, some projects have moved to a more modular architecture. so that you can do all of your customer-specific code as extensions. And Rehan had a follow-on question. Time is too crucial for companies to meet delivery commitments with customers. Is there a process recommendation to meet such demanding situations? That's a tough situation, Rehan. I think at some point the argument has to be made for more haste, less speed. If you find yourself doing customer customizations on a very tight time frame, it may be that it is worth taking a step back and asking how you can spend a little bit less time restructuring the project to enable those customer customizations to be done faster, or refactor common customer customizations. And that is a little bit of a tongue twister there. Refactor common customizations into common code that can be sent upstream. Again, I think if you find yourself doing a lot of customizations and that is dominating the development time that you have, that's not providing any innovation. That's not providing any value to you for the project. I think there's an expectation when you're developing a product on top of open source that the project will continue to develop on its own, but that isn't what happens. The project is developed by its users, by the vendors who are depending on it. And if you don't take some time to think about how can I make this project better for everybody, what will happen is that things will go stale, and you will end up having to migrate away from that project in maybe a couple of years and figuring out something else. And that's going to be a very, very expensive thing when it happens. So it may be worth rethinking the value proposition of working on that project to have that short-term, long-term balance.
And then Dave, I know we're at the hour mark, but I had one question from my side. So more at like the project level, we're trying to provide, a common place for organizations to come together and, discuss priorities and help to come up with common objectives that can make this upstream approach more easily adoptable for them. Do you have any good best practices from other projects or organizations that help to, bring together various commercial interests and help to convene around a common roadmap and set of priorities? So.
Well, talking to each other is a good first step. I would recommend that if you have an identifiable group of individuals or vendors, to convene a regular meeting, if you can, virtual meeting, to get people talking. I think publishing a roadmap, even if it's a vague roadmap, there's some best practices for community roadmaps, which I like. One is to say, here are the things we want to have happen, but these are not resourced. And have people from your community understand that, if they want these things to happen, they're not going to get onto a shorter term roadmap on their own. So you've got a separation between the wish list and here are the things that are going to happen for the next release, the N+1 release, the N+2 release. And really that's, I think in terms of architecture, like some of the things that successful projects do or have mentorship schemes so that people who are more familiar with the code can help people become familiar with the code or become familiar with open source practices, good code review practices, make sure that, that patches, the way that you help make sure that your patches are reviewed quickly is to review other people's patches quickly, because you create this kind of virtuous cycle. I hope some of those tips are useful. They're kind of generic and it's difficult to get into specifics, but I hope that helps kind of point you in the right direction.
Yeah, no, that has been. So, well, thank you very much, Dave, for pulling together these very informative slides and spending your time today to give this webinar. We will finalize the recording and send out the link to the slides in the recording and, publish a blog post with summaries of what was discussed. But thank you everybody for attending, and thank you once again, Dave.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Let me stop sharing my screen.